I didn't even get to sit down. The conference room was still filling up when Colin cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, Jenna, I'm afraid we have to let you go." Everyone stopped. Silence slammed down like a steel door. My hands were still holding the coffee tray I'd brought in for the team. One cup even had his name on it. At first, I laughed. I thought it was some awkward joke, a strange, poorly timed prank, but then he pulled out the envelope. The kind no one ever wants to see. It had my name on it. Typed. Centered. And dated 3 days ago. Not today. Not even yesterday. They planned this. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer to speak in private. He just slid the envelope across the table like he was handing me a parking ticket. Half the room stared. The other half pretended to check their phones. But I saw their eyes. I saw the interns exchange glances. I saw Kyle from accounting lower his gaze like he was ashamed for me. I couldn't move. Not out of fear. Out of confusion. I had just finished reconciling the Q2 audit he pushed up by 2 weeks. The same one he said would make or break the board's trust. 12 years. 12 years I gave this company. No missed deadlines. No audit flags. No complaints. And now I was being humiliated, fired over what? A minor discrepancy in a vendor report? A $782 variance I hadn't even reviewed yet? Or was that just the excuse? The coffee in my hand went cold before I could blink. Was I being punished for doing my job too well? If you've ever been blindsided, cut down in front of a room that suddenly felt too small, too silent, too familiar, drop a single dot in the comments. Just one. So people like me know we're not the only ones. I don't remember leaving the room. One moment I was standing there, holding a tray of coffee like it was the only thing tethering me to gravity, and the next I was outside, sunlight far too bright, wind cutting against my cheeks like it had something personal to say. I walked without really choosing a direction. My shoes clicked down the marble steps, across the plaza, past the revolving doors I'd passed through every morning for over a decade. No one followed. No one stopped me. Just a blur of elevator dings and people pretending not to stare. My car was in the garage, but I couldn't bring myself to go there yet. Instead, I wandered. I ended up on a bench 3 blocks away, in front of a dry cleaner's I'd never noticed before. My name badge was still clipped to my blazer. The little magnetic strip sparkled under the sun like it didn't just get me exiled. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took it off and dropped it into my purse like it might bite me if I held on too long. My phone buzzed. 5 missed calls. 2 from my sister, 1 from my dentist for some reason, and 1 text from Kyle. "That wasn't right. I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Because I didn't know how to form a sentence that didn't start with "what the hell just happened." Back at my apartment, I stepped through the door and immediately dropped my bag on the floor. I didn't even take off my shoes. The air inside was stale. Quiet. The kind of quiet that felt intentional, like it had been waiting for me. I sat on the couch and just stared. At nothing. At the wall. At the dead plant I forgot to water 3 weeks ago. It didn't matter. Nothing felt real. Colin's voice kept replaying in my head. That polished corporate tone he used when pretending to be human. The way he said my name like it was a formality, a line item. "We have to let you go, Jenna." Altri. Let me go? As if I'd been clinging to something I didn't deserve. As if this wasn't the same man who once pulled me aside after a brutal board meeting and said, "You saved our asses in there. You're the sharpest one on this floor." What changed? Was it the report I flagged last quarter? The one with the unusually high retainer fee no one could explain? Or had he always seen me as disposable, just waiting for the right moment to cut me loose? I curled up on the edge of the couch, shoes still on, my jacket still buttoned, and for the first time in years, I felt small. Not tired, not even angry, just small. Like I'd spent too long building something I thought was solid, only to find out it had always been hollow underneath. Outside my window, people were walking their dogs, unloading groceries, laughing into their phones. The world kept spinning like nothing had happened. But something had happened. To me. And I didn't know if I was supposed to cry, scream, or laugh at how quickly everything I'd built just vanished. So I did none of it. I just sat there, staring at the reflection of myself in the black screen of the television. And for the first time, I asked myself the question I hadn't dared to say aloud. What if this wasn't just about a mistake? What if someone wanted me gone? I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just the shock, it was the math. Something kept pulling at the edge of my mind like a loose thread on a sweater, small, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. The discrepancy. The $782 error Colin had used as justification for my public execution. It didn't sit right. I knew every audit report I touched like the back of my hand. My job was to know. I had built a reputation for it. Jenna Lawson, the human spreadsheet, the woman who once spotted a misplaced decimal in a Q1 report 5 minutes before it went to the board. I didn't make careless mistakes. So why did this one show up under my name? At 3:12 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep. I padded across the apartment, still in yesterday's clothes, and flipped open my personal laptop. The one I hadn't touched in weeks. Dust clung to the corners of the screen. It flickered to life slower than I remembered. I navigated straight to my backup folder. The mirror copy of every project file I'd worked on at Helix Core, synced nightly to an encrypted local drive. A habit I picked up after IT once accidentally wiped an entire compliance folder during a software update. They laughed. I didn't. I clicked into the audit reports from the last 2 quarters and pulled up the vendor summary, Rowan Biotech, the client supposedly misbilled in the Q2 expense sheet. And there it was. The line item. Vendor payment ID number 11,793. Except, the version I had didn't show the error. The numbers added up. I checked the source invoice, the approval chain, the timestamp logs. Everything was clean. No missing decimals, no reverse signs, no incorrect account links. I frowned, reopened the email Colin had sent to the board, the one with the corrected report attached. That version showed the discrepancy. The vendor expense had been reclassified under a different GL code, changing the categorization entirely and triggering a flag. But it wasn't in my file. I ran a diff scan side-by-side comparison of both documents. There were changes. Quiet ones. Metadata alterations. One cell shifted, another label renamed. The kind of edits that wouldn't register in version control unless you were looking for them. And the changes had been made 3 days ago. The same day my termination letter was printed. My pulse spiked. I sat up straighter. My eyes scanned the files again, faster this time, trying to see what I might have missed. But there it was, clear as day. I hadn't made a mistake. Someone else had made it look like I had. And not just anyone. Someone with access to compliance files. Someone who knew exactly which cells to tweak, which reports the board wouldn't double-check, which flags would trigger automatic internal review. Someone like Colin. I didn't have proof. Not yet. But I had the beginning of something. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen in the dark. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the fan and the low tick of the clock. A 718 Sandford mistake. That's what they claimed. But, in that moment, it didn't feel like a mistake at all. It felt like a setup. And I wasn't about to let it slide. The sun was just beginning to rise when I realized I hadn't moved in hours. I was still sitting there barefoot, hair a mess, wrapped in an old sweatshirt I hadn't worn since grad school. My screen glowed in the half-dark, dozens of tabs open, spreadsheets layered like puzzle pieces I hadn't yet figured out how to fit together. But something in me had shifted. This wasn't about a clerical error anymore. It hadn't been for a while. This was about control. Colin wanted me gone, and he made it look like an accident. But he'd forgotten one small detail. I don't throw things away. Not audit notes. Not receipts. And definitely not the compliance logs I'd quietly mirrored to my personal drive for years just in case. I opened the archive folder. 10 years worth of reconciliations, audit trails, vendor breakdowns, and internal memos all neatly categorized, date-stamped, and backed up offline. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit. Helix Core had a habit of losing things when they became inconvenient, so I didn't let anything stay in just one place. I clicked into a folder labeled Vendor Review 2020 Restructure. It had nothing to do with my firing, or so I thought. But something about the timestamp tugged at me. It was dated during the last time we'd undergone mass layoffs. Dozens of positions were cut in under a week. At the time, I'd been asked to fast-track the compliance summary. I pulled up the files, and there it was. A list of third-party vendors approved for transition consulting. Most of them were standard names firms I recognized. But one stood out. Draytech Advisory. At first, I couldn't place it. But then I remembered a conversation from a Christmas party 2 years ago. Colin, drink in hand, introducing a man in a navy suit as an old buddy from the startup days. I didn't catch the name then, but the logo on the card he handed mate was the same as the header on this invoice. Draytech had billed Helix Core for over $420,000 in strategic onboarding consulting during a quarter when we weren't onboarding anyone. And the approval signature? Colin's. My hands were suddenly clammy. I searched the folder for other Draytech entries. There were 5. Each tied to some internal project with a vague name like Phase Transition Optimization or Equity Risk Readjustment. None of them had correlating internal memos, no emails, no meeting notes, just invoices. Approved. Paid. Buried. It felt too smooth. Too perfect. No one else would have noticed. But I had. I knew what normal audit paperwork looked like. This wasn't it. This was camouflage. And it was working until now. My heart was pounding, but my face stayed calm. I'd been in this game long enough to know when I'd just stepped into something much bigger than myself. Colin hadn't just set me up. He'd used me as a smokescreen to distract from something deeper. Something dirty. Maybe even criminal. And now that I was out of the building, I wasn't a threat anymore. Just another disgruntled employee. Or so he thought. I minimized the files, opened a clean spreadsheet, and started listing every Draytech payment by date, amount, and project code. If there was a pattern, I was going to find it. I didn't know where it would lead yet. But something in my gut told me. I had just pulled the pin on a very quiet bomb. The thing about trust is, you don't notice it until it's gone. Or until it's weaponized against you. I used to think Colin Drake was the reason I survived my first 2 years at Helix Core. He was sharp, charismatic in that clean-shaven executive way, and always seemed 2 steps ahead of chaos. He'd call it situational clarity. I'd called it luck, but I admired it. He'd pull me aside after tough board meetings, drop lines like, "You've got the instincts. Most people just follow templates." When I got promoted to head of internal audit, he was the first to say I deserved it. Not in a performative, clapping in the hallway kind of way, just a nod, a small smile, and knew you'd get there. So I believed him. Believed he saw me. Believed he respected me. But the deeper I dug, the harder it became to hold on to that version of him. I was building out the Draytech spreadsheet dates, payments, vague project titles when something clicked. One of the internal payment notes was signed off using his old initials, CDR. That was strange. Colin had quietly dropped the R from company docs 2 years ago after rebranding himself for the board. Which meant the file was older than it looked. Or it had been duplicated and edited. I opened the archived email chain from the 2020 vendor review and cross-checked it with the invoice logs. There were inconsistencies. File creation dates that didn't match approval dates. PDFs that had been flattened stripped of metadata, like someone was covering their tracks. And then it hit me. Draytech Advisory wasn't just some shady vendor, it was real but hollow. A shell. A name with just enough history to pass surface-level scrutiny but no real infrastructure behind it. And that man Colin introduced at the party, The one in the navy suit with the Rolex and limp handshake. His name wasn't in any vendor registry. But his LinkedIn? Still live. Lucas Reigns. Founder. Dre Tech Advisory. And right there, in the education section, Princeton University, class of '04, roomed with Colin Drake. I stared at the screen. Roommates. He'd once laughed about it, said they used to split ramen and dream about stock options. Now here they were, one signing the checks, the other cashing them. And me? The idiot cleaning up behind them. I leaned back, let the weight of it settle. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't sloppiness. This was calculated. Colin hadn't just manipulated the system. He'd weaponized it. Wrapped his fraud in just enough process to pass audit, trusting no one would question the fine print. Because they trusted him. Because I trusted him. That was the hardest part. I kept thinking back to little moments. The times I flagged inconsistencies and got waved off. The way he'd pat me on the shoulder and say, "Let the numbers breathe a little, Jenna. Not everything has to be perfect." I thought it was mentorship. Turns out, it was misdirection. Every time I brought up concerns, he deflected, dangled praise just long enough to keep me busy, reassured me that I was too good to be wasting my time chasing shadows. But now I saw it. The shadows had names, and invoice numbers, and fake project codes. And the man I once thought of as my mentor was standing behind all of it. I could have let it go. Really? I thought about it. I sat in my kitchen for hours, laptop screen dimmed, cursor blinking like a pulse. The files were there, dozens of theme, a thread I could tug if I wanted to. But part of me hesitated. Because once you pull on one, you don't get to stop. Not until the whole thing unravels. And that's the part that scared me. Not the digging. Not the risk. The silence afterward. The space where you used to feel safe, now filled with the sound of consequences. I'd seen what happened to people who spoke up. I'd watched it play out in conference rooms, in Slack threads, in quiet terminations chalked up to performance misalignment. The whistleblower always ends up alone. Always. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a petty office grudge. This was calculated fraud. Executed by a man I once trusted, protected by a system I helped build. And I was the only one with a full copy of the map. So, I called her. Talia Reyes. Whistleblower attorney. Former SEC investigator. We met once at a compliance summit in Chicago. She gave a talk on corporate retaliation and how to build a legally airtight file. I remembered her saying something that stuck with me. The truth isn't enough. You need structure. You need proof. You need to be 5 steps ahead of the people who make the rules and break them. She picked up on the third ring. Jenna? Her voice was calm. Sharp. Like she'd already guessed why I was calling. I need guidance, I said quietly. You calling as a survivor? She asked. Or a witness? I paused. Then, both. She didn't ask for details right away. Just told me to secure every file in an offline drive, keep communication off personal devices, and document everything, not just the data, but how I found it, when, in what order. Context mattered. I got to work. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. My living room became a war room. Post, it's on the wall. Timeline sketches. Side-by-side comparisons of original versus altered reports. I labeled folders like Vendor Flow, Phase 2, and CDR linked approval chains. Every document was backed up twice, once on an encrypted SSD, once in a sealed envelope I dropped at my cousin's law office without explanation. Just in case. I built what Talia called a bulletproof briefing file. A roadmap for regulators. A checklist for justice. And somewhere between tagging the third shell company and mapping payment loops through fake departments, I stopped feeling scared. I started feeling angry. Not the explosive kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sharpens over time. The kind that whispers. If not you, then who? Because if I didn't say something, if I didn't do something, how many more people would Colin burn through before someone else stumbled onto a number that didn't quite add up? So here's the moment. The decision point. The line in the sand I wasn't willing to step back from. If you think Jenna should keep going, should expose the truth, no matter what it costs, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. Because it does. It started small. A Reddit thread. Buried under a finance gossip subreddit with a clickbait title. Disgruntled ex-employee leaks bogus vendor files after being fired. 2. There was a blurry photo attached cropped tight, clearly zoomed in from an old panel I spoke at in 2018. The caption underneath read, "Watch out for compliance Karens with a grudge." I didn't breathe for a full 10 seconds. Not because it hurt. Not yet. But because it felt intentional. I refreshed the page. New comments were piling up fast, people speculating, quoting sources close to the matter, making jokes about weaponized spreadsheets and drama queens in HR. Onsto. I closed the tab, heart thudding. It was just noise, I told myself. Just trolls, it'll pass. But then Gina texted. Gina Morris, a senior analyst who'd once called me the human firewall during a crunch week pizza break. Her message was just a screenshot. No caption, no context. The image. A Slack message from Colin bolded, pinned to the general channel. We're aware of certain rumors circulating online. Disgruntled former employees sometimes feel the need to lash out. Rest assured, there's no merit to these claims. Stay focused. That was it. Clean. Polished. And surgical. He didn't mention my name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that office knew who he meant. My chest tightened. Not from shame but recognition. This wasn't damage control. This was a preemptive strike. He was scrubbing the narrative, prepping the team to see me not as a whistleblower, but as a bitter, unstable ex-employee with a vendetta. And it was working. I opened my inbox. 3 unread messages. One from my gym asking if I was okay. Apparently someone had called and canceled my membership, claiming I'd moved out of state. Another was from a financial blog requesting comment on allegations of falsified reporting. And the last? An anonymous email. No name. No greeting. Just 2 lines. You should have stayed quiet. You'll regret this. No signature. No clue who sent it. But the tone? Familiar. I closed my laptop slowly, fingers trembling but not from fear. Not entirely. I knew this move. I'd seen it used before. Discredit, distract, destroy credibility before truth can settle. They weren't trying to fight the evidence. They were trying to erase me. It worked. Tune people who didn't know better. The optics were perfect. An ex-employee lashing out conveniently right before audit season. And maybe if I'd been younger, newer in the game, maybe I would have backed down. But I'd spent 12 years watching people like Colin rewrite history in real time. This wasn't new. It was just my turn in the crosshairs. Still, it hurt in places I didn't expect. Not because I needed the validation, but because I had spent so long building my name, my work ethic, my integrity brick by brick. And now someone was trying to bulldoze it all with a single, weaponized sentence. I stared out the window, city lights, blinking like silent judgment. They wanted me small, quiet, ashamed. But instead, I felt something else rising. Not panic. Not even rage. Precision. If they were going to try to erase me, then I'd make damn sure the trail I left behind was impossible to delete. I was down to the last 10 folders. After days of sifting through invoice logs, expense trails, and anonymized vendor files, I had hit that quiet moment, the place where most people would stop, tell themselves it was enough, and walk away. But I knew better. Truth hides in the boring stuff. The repetitive. The things no one double-checks because they're too ordinary to question. I was combing through one of the final approval folders, a generic name, nothing suspicious on the surface, when I spotted a file that felt off. It was labeled Q3. Reclass. Approval final. PDF. I almost skipped it. I'd seen 3 other versions of that same file, all clean, all internally approved. But this one had a metadata tag that didn't match the rest. It had been saved at 2:14 a.m. by a non-corporate email address. That's not standard practice. At Helix Core, approvals went through secure VPN channels. Everything done after hours still logged under official credentials. This one didn't. I opened the document. At first glance, it looked identical to the others. Same formatting, same headers, same signatures. But when I overlaid it on the last official version, the differences emerged. One vendor code had been replaced. Just one. DRK 7421 became DRT 7421. One letter. One change. But that tiny tweak rerouted $97,000 from a closed operations account into an external consulting budget buried 3 layers down in a shadow cost center. And the approval signature? Colin's. Same as always. Except this one was timestamped 2:14 a.m. And that email in the metadata? It matched the personal address I'd once seen on his laptop screen during a late-night review call. He thought no one noticed. But I always noticed. That's when my pulse changed. Not racing. Just sharper. Like my body was catching up to what my brain had already processed. This wasn't sloppiness. This was a carefully planted mutation. He didn't alter everything just enough. Just the pieces that rerouted money under different aliases. Ones that wouldn't trigger audit flags because the account codes technically existed, even if they were never used properly. The moment was so quiet, I could hear the hum of my hard drive spinning. My own breath felt loud. I pulled the metadata. Confirmed it. Same hash signature. Same routing as the previous reports. But this one had been saved manually. Late at night. Outside protocol. He'd slipped it in between version approvals. Replaced the original just before it was distributed. I sat back, stared at the glowing screen. That was it. The trigger file. The one that proved intent. Not just a messy system or lazy oversight, but deliberate, documented manipulation. I copied it. Isolated it. Saved it to 3 places. One on my encrypted drive. One on an offline USB. And one printed on acid-free paper to be sealed and stored off-site. This wasn't just evidence. This was the fuse. Colin had tried to erase me. But in doing so, he left behind a fingerprint. And now I had it. It didn't feel dramatic. There was no music, no thunderclap. Just me, sitting in sweatpants at my kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of tea beside me, and a single folder open on my desktop. Inside, everything. The trigger file. Yes, but also the full timeline. Vendor aliases. Inconsistent approval chains. Metadata logs. Copies of internal policy violations. A quiet forest of red flags Colin never thought anyone would see in full. And now, someone would. I started with the SEC. Form TCR. I'd read through it twice already. It asked for clarity, order, precision, things I had in abundance. I filled in every field like it was a final exam. No speculation. No grand accusations. Just data. Cold, dated, traceable. Then I encrypted the archive. 256-bit AES, multi-step passphrase, printed a hard copy for legal. Another for off-site backup. Next stop. Ours whistleblower office. Different rules. Different scope. But Dratek's fake payments overlapped into tax territory. Falsified vendor deductions, unreported payouts, enough for their alarms to ring. Finally, I wrote the summary. Not as a sob story. Not even as a complaint. Just as a map. Where it started. Where it split. Where it hid. Then I sent it. All of it. To the SEC. To the IRS. To Talia. And one final copier formatted, condensed to a YouTuber named Chris Layton. He ran a forensic audit channel that took down 2 hedge funds in 2022. I remembered him from a finance conference where no one took him seriously, until he dropped a 40-minute video with annotated footnotes and 4 million views. My email to him was short. This is not for publication yet. Hold it. If the feds move, delete it. If they don't, you know what to do. I hit send. The screen blinked. Nothing exploded. No dramatic alerts. No sirens. Just the quiet confirmation, message delivered. And yet, everything felt different. I sat back, staring at my reflection in the black screen. For the first time since that Tuesday morning in the conference room, I felt control shift. Not fully. Not publicly. But the axis had tilted. Just enough. The strike had landed. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't threatening. I wasn't begging anyone to believe me. I had simply told the truth loud enough for the right people to hear. And if you've ever reached that moment, the one where you stop asking for justice and start delivering it, then you already know this feeling. So, if you're watching this, and you've ever built the case no one asked for ever, stared down a lie wearing a smile and chose to keep receipts instead of revenge, hit the like button. Because this isn't about rage. It's about clarity. And clarity is the one thing they can't spin. It started with a headline. SEC freezes accounts tied to executive fraud at Helix Core. No names, no drama, just black letters on a white background. But to me, it read like a verdict. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there, in the same kitchen chair I'd used for every sleepless night that week, tea cooling beside me, fingers still on the trackpad. The article was short clinical. Multiple vendor accounts flagged. Ongoing forensic audit initiated. Tip from whistleblower cited. They didn't need to say my name. I knew it was me. I scrolled slowly, line by line. Phrases I recognized from the reports I had submitted began to appear, reframed through legalese. Unusual vendor activity. Duplicate invoice metadata. Irregularities in late-night file approvals. Every breadcrumb I had left behind was now under federal lock. And then the real unraveling began. Screenshots started flooding my inbox. Internal Slack channels at Helix Core were melting down in real time. People were panicking, project leads, senior managers, even HR. The legal team had sent out a blast message. Do not delete anything. All backups are being pulled. This is federal. Emergency meetings scheduled. Calendar invites flying. The silence from leadership was deafening. But Colin? Colin was gone. No statements. No denial. Just digital silence. The man who once flooded inboxes with corporate inspiration quotes was nowhere to be found. His Slack status flickered away for hours, then disappeared entirely. And then came the second wave. Investor calls leaked. Board members scrambling to contain the fallout. A 22% dip in share price within 48 hours. Clients pausing contracts. 2 major vendors pulling out completely. By Friday morning, it was chaos. Another headline. Helix Core Board issues statement on financial misconduct by former CFO. They called it unforeseen internal irregularities. They said, the matter is under independent review. They promised cooperation with all federal agencies. What they didn't say? That they knew. That the approvals had signatures. That internal flags had been dismissed by the very person now under investigation. I read it all in silence. Not with triumph. With clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about accountability. And now, the house Colin built stone by stone, lie by lie, was starting to buckle under its own weight. I checked one last folder. The backup logs. The same ones I used to help maintain back when I was still trusted, still in the building. A batch of vendor files had been flagged for deletion the day before I was fired. But they were still there. Archived, dated, recovered. Proof not just of the fraud, but of the attempt to bury it. The collapse wasn't coming. It had already begun. And I wasn't standing in the wreckage. I was watching it fall from the outside. From safety. The kettle clicked off just as the news segment ended. I poured the water slowly, letting the steam rise into the quiet of my apartment. No music, no phone buzz. Just the hum of the fridge and the soft clink of ceramic against countertop. It was the first morning in weeks I hadn't opened my laptop before the sun came up. I didn't need to. Everything was already in motion. I sat by the window, mug in hand, watching a neighbor's dog chase leaves across the sidewalk. The city looked the same, buses rolling by, people rushing toward morning meetings, a teenager in headphones nodding along to a rhythm only they could hear. It was strange. How the world kept turning. Even when yours had spun completely off axis. I took a slow sip. No sugar, no honey, just the bitter warmth of black tea. It grounded me. Reminded me I was still here, still whole. The past 10 days had been a storm. A quiet one, mostly. The kind that didn't break windows or snap trees but peeled the paint off everything you thought was solid. And now, the wind had stilled. The fallout hadn't fully landed, but the tremors had spread far enough to shift the foundation. Colin was suspended pending investigation. Helix Core's board was under review. And the digital trail I left behind was being picked apart by people with federal badges and legal authority. It was no longer mine to carry. And that, more than anything, brought peace. I leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed. The same kitchen. Same chipped mug. Same backup laptop still sitting on the side table with its charging light blinking patiently. But something fundamental had changed. Me. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't hoping for redemption. I didn't need my job back. The part of me that once craved approval from leadership, from mentors, from the very system that tried to silence me had gone quiet. It felt like walking away from a locked room you used to live in. And realizing you don't miss the air inside. My reflection in the window looked steady. Not proud, not victorious. Just still. And sometimes, stillness is the loudest thing in the world. I remembered something my grandmother used to say when I was little. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is be impossible to shake. I used to think she meant being fearless. Now I think she meant being unmoved by noise. Let them call me dramatic. Let them say I overreacted. Let them reframe the narrative in every boardroom where the truth makes people uncomfortable. Because I didn't just expose fraud. I reclaimed my voice. And sometimes, the cleanest kind of justice isn't loud or televised or celebrated. Sometimes, it's just the feeling of waking up, brewing a cup of tea, and not flinching when your name is in the news. Sometimes, it's silence. And knowing it's finally yours. They said I was too intense, too focused, too detail-obsessed, that I needed to let things go, trust the process, be a team player. They smiled when they said it, as if it were advice. As if what they really meant wasn't, you're too much, but you're too dangerous when you're right. I used to carry that with me, quietly. Let it seep into my posture, my tone, the way I phrased suggestions as questions. I learned to make myself smaller in rooms where truth made people uncomfortable. But here's what no one tells you about being the one who notices, the one who reads the fine print, who follows the numbers past where the presentation ends. Eventually, you see the whole picture. And once you do, you don't unsee it. That's the real lesson. Not that systems can fail. Not that people in power lie. Not even that truth takes time to find its footing. No, the lesson is simpler and sharper. They don't fear your mistake, they fear your memory. Because someone who forgets is manageable. But someone who documents? Who builds quiet timelines, cross-references footnotes, saves backup copies without being asked? That person becomes a threat. So they paint her as emotional, difficult, vindictive, because if they can discredit the messenger, they never have to deal with the message. But not this time. Because this time, I didn't back down. I didn't storm out. I didn't go quietly. I wrote it all down. And I handed it over. Not for revenge. Not even for justice, really. I did it because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Because every woman in every boardroom who's ever been told to relax, smile more, or stop making waves, deserves at least one example of what happens when someone refuses to be erased. They tried to silence me with a typo, but it wasn't a mistake. I wasn't the mistake. I was the mirror. And Colin shattered himself trying to break it. So, if you're watching this, whether you're in finance or food service, in a cubicle or a classroom, and someone has ever made you feel like your diligence was a flaw, your questions were inconvenient, or your standards made them uncomfortable, don't shrink. You don't have to become loud to be clear. You don't have to be aggressive to be right. Just be consistent. Be watchful. Be ready. Because the truth has a way of finding its way out. And when it does, it often looks a lot like you still standing, still calm, still sipping tea. And if any part of this story felt familiar to you, leave a comment with the words, "I'm not the mistake." Let someone else scrolling know they're not alone.